ESMoA. ESMoA is standing for Experimentally Structured Museum of Art, and we are located here in Lawndale in California. And we, ESMoA, acknowledge that we are holding this panel discussion on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tangwa people. We recognize the Tangwa people as a traditional land caretaker of the Towanga, Los Angeles Basin, Southern Channel Islands. We also acknowledge that Los Angeles County is home of the largest indigenous population in the U.S. Today, we are excited to host this important panel discussion on deconstructing U.S. immigration myths and the human side of immigration from an artist's perspective, followed by question and answers. We want to give a warm welcome to our outstanding panelist, Julio Salgado, artist and activist, Álvaro D, artist and art advocate, and our moderator, Anthony Pawelski, sorry, I practiced before, Pawelski, attorney and activist. This panel discussion will be filmed and live streamed on Instagram. With that, I'm very happy to pass it over to our moderator to take it from here and guide us.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. I'm very happy to be here at ESMoA today talking about a topic that's deeply personal to me as an immigration attorney. I'm also very happy to have a panel of amazing artists that are going to share their personal experiences. When we were preparing this panel, I really thought it came down to three things. Education, meaning what does the average person know about U.S. immigration? Second, breaking down misconceptions, because misconceptions are very powerful, can actually shape our policies in negative directions. And third, to humanize immigration. When you actually meet an immigrant, you might not know that. Justin Bieber, for example, he's an immigrant. We don't really care because he fits the definition of what we might think a normal person or immigrant should be. So before we dive into the panel, I'm going to do a primer on some U.S. immigration history. Now, this is not an in-depth history. It is a very brief survey of some main points that are incredibly important because they reflect common patterns in our immigration history of exclusion, maybe changes where we become more welcoming, and reactions to different foreign events. So we can turn to that slide, then we'll take a look at some immigration history. So prior to the 1880s, the U.S. essentially was an open border. The image there is actually a citizenship certificate of a family member on my father's side of the family. He came over, I believe, sometime in the late 1880s, and pretty easy process. We don't really talk about that because there really were not many restrictions unless they were race-based and being tied to the slave trade, or in some cases the Deep South. It really was focused on not having communicable diseases and being able to pay taxes. The big change we see is in the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. That's where most historians, at least in U.S. immigration law, start teaching it because that's the first time the U.S. is really taking a stance saying, you are not welcome here. The concern was that the Chinese were driving down labor cost, and so we wanted to protect the American workforce. But as a result, we essentially banned Chinese immigration until almost 1943. There were exceptions, but for the most part, that's where we start seeing the creation of quotas and a system that really is exclusionary. The 1891 Act is noteworthy because that signifies immigration is a federal issue. And so sometimes in the media we hear about states wanting to enforce their own laws or their own requirements. Not under the Constitution. Immigration is a federal issue as it deals with massive movements of people, finances, and also our global relationships with other foreign nations. Noteworthy is we have the alien land laws in California, and I picked that just because California has this image as, oh, it's the land of prosper. Depends on who you're from, who you are and where you're from. This particular act really was limiting at keeping foreigners from owning land in California. Granted, there were exceptions to and workarounds, but we can see here that there's this change that we don't want certain people to have access to wealth. You also have to keep in mind, immigration history is only one part of U.S. history. We have different events going on, like the Great Depression later on, World War I, World War II, and so our foreign events will shape our U.S. history. So we start entering the more modern era of immigration, which was the 1924 Johnson and Reed Act. And that act celebrated its 100-year birthday, but is really the basis of our current immigration system in terms of quotas and the idea of creating a formal visa system where you come to the U.S. with a specific purpose. But the act itself was designed to keep certain immigrants out. So I haven't talked about my family yet. I identify as Italian American and Polish American. Previously, the Polish side came before 1880s, no issues. My Italian side came in 1903, so there were no real restrictions. My great-grandmother came on a boat with some other family members, paid a fee, that was it. The 1924 Act is really the most concerning one because, and I'll give you a quote from Rep. Johnson. At the time, he declared that there were waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who were filthy, un-American, and often dangerous, specifically referring to Italians, Greeks, Poles, Turks, and Russians. So this act really put a quota system in place for nations that be perceived as desirable. We move a little bit further, and as we enter the World War II era, we have the internment of Japanese Americans. Gardena Torrance is the home to a number of survivors of these camps. It really wasn't until 1988 that we saw an apology from the U.S. government recognizing how we actually interned our own American citizens or attempted to deport American citizens. World War II is unique in that we lost our labor workforce, and Álvaro is going to talk a little bit later about the Bracero program, but that ran from 1942 to 1964, and that was a labor program where the U.S. recruited Mexicans to come to the U.S. to work in contracted environments, farms, the railroad, and the Bracero program was controversial because it was usually single men going up. It did separate families and served as the catalyst for creating relationship challenges with Mexico and the U.S., where Mexico was upset that that the U.S. was exploiting Mexicans for cheap labor, and that also ties into Operation Wetback, which was politically motivated, where the U.S. was actually conducting raids to deport Mexicans back to Mexico, despite running the Bracero program at the same time. Very conflicting views of immigration, where we want Mexicans here to work in our fields while Americans are away fighting a war, but at the same time, there's too many and they need to leave. Very conflicting. The Bracero program winded down in 1964, and it coincides with advances in farm technology, labor movements, and other social changes. But the resulting fallout was 22 years of cheap labor with U.S. and Mexico. And once it winded down, it left this view that if you go to the U.S., there are better opportunities, better pay. And so we never addressed it as a nation how to reconcile the closing of the Bracero program with their need for foreign workers. Next slide. The 1952 Immigration Act, we ended some of our racial quotas. We begin to modernize the system. But we go back to an offensive look, and we do view immigration as something we have to police and control. Once we hit 1965, we get to a more modern system where we want to be more welcoming. We are building in percentages of green cards for employment, family reunification, refugees, but we do still have a quota within the system. And you can see moving forward in the 1970s, we have other acts that are put in place where they increase our immigrant population, but we start slowing down our immigration then, and this is what we say is more of the modern era, where immigration is being looked at in a little bit of a hostile lens. So I had a Supreme Court case, Pyler v. Doe to the slide, simply because this is coming up in the news as a recent topic. And the decision from the Supreme Court was that it doesn't matter what a child's immigration status is, it's better for the American public and for everyone for these kids to be in school. So right now we have movements in some states where school districts do not want immigrant children in because they view they're taking away something from Americans. From a public health standpoint, it's utterly ridiculous. A child has no idea that they're even maybe undocumented on a visa. And similarly, the state of California and many other states do offer health care benefits to people regardless of immigration status. From a public health standpoint, it's cheaper to treat someone for stitches than if the stitches are not treated. They are then maybe 6 weeks in the urgent care because of a deep infection. So there are economic angles we have to balance. 1986 is the formation of IRCA, and for many people that's when they say, oh, well, my family did it the right way. Well, for the immigration system, it depends on when you came. IRCA is noteworthy because it offered large-scale amnesty to populations that previously had no avenue to change their immigration status. We did expand visa programs in this massive body of legislation, and we continued in 1990 with the Immigration Act. In 1990, we placed more of a focus on diversity, trying to get unrepresented countries into the U.S. and expand our different work visa categories. That will bring me to the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. This is really the last major immigration reform we've had in the U.S. So we have some students that are filming. We have immigration laws that are older than them. That's actually, frankly, very sad. These laws don't contemplate the internet, working from home, or really anything that we take for granted today as the benefits of modern technology. The 1996 Act really set the precedent for more of a militarization at the southern border, where we really shifted our rhetoric that we have to police these borders and protect them. And this legislation also resulted in the 3- and 10-year bar, which we'll talk about shortly. More modern immigration history, we have really 3 items. The 9/11 terrorist attacks were a wake-up call to the U.S. intelligence agencies, and so we rehauled our entire system with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and that placed 22 diverse agencies under one body. So many times, even in the current immigration system, the different agencies are part of the Department of Homeland Security. They don't actually talk to each other, so they still have different missions. And a more positive note, we had the creation of DACA in 2012, which very simply was a program to allow individuals here to pursue life. Many times people say, oh, well, if you just get your papers fixed, it'll be okay. Sometimes there isn't a way to fix your immigration status in the U.S., and I'll talk about status very shortly. But DACA was an amazing program. The downside is it's been in continual litigation for over 10 years, and no new applicants can apply. The last modern piece I'll throw in is the Muslim travel ban. From a personal perspective, it was completely pointless and xenophobic, but from an immigration angle, it showed how much power the executive branch, meaning the president, can wield in certain situations. So as you can see, our history really was never consistent with immigration. It depends on our labor movement, who's in office, and we've stalled on any major reform in over 30 years. So the reason I want to go over some common immigration terms is the news gets them wrong a lot, or doesn't understand the nuance of it. So the first term I'll cover is the word alien. It's not a little green space invader. It's the term the Immigration Nationality Act uses for someone who is not a U.S. citizen. In my immigration writings to the government, I don't use the word alien. I use non-citizen, beneficiary, the person's name. This is a person, this is a human. And depending on how we use the term, it actually does impact a judge's opinion in immigration courts. There are statistics that show if a judge humanizes the person, you have a better outcome for that case. The next term, EWE, is entry without inspection. That is really the classic view someone has of a person sneaking over the border. In reality, our borders are so policed that this is a very small percentage of what we see for immigration. It shocks people many times when they realize that people overstay their work visas and then become undocumented and they're not in the system legally. For our immigration system, we have 2 categories of visas. An immigrant visa, which is a green card. There's many different ways to get a green card. You can get it through marriage, through employer, through the diversity lottery. But the number of green cards are capped each year, and as I mentioned, we haven't had reform in over 30 years, so the quotas we're using for employer-based green cards are 140,000. It's an incredibly low cap when you consider no one country can have a higher percentage, which means if you're a doctor from India, you could be waiting 80 years for your green card in the U.S. because we've not updated our numbers. The non-immigrant visa category are what we commonly see as like tourist visa, student visa, H-1B specialty worker visa. These are all different categories. Our visas are letter-based. I'm not going to go through the full alphabet because that's boring and it's almost like an ABC song. I mentioned the 3 or 10-year bars because this is an area a lot of people don't grasp, is that if you've been in the U.S. and overstayed your visa or you work unauthorized, you may trigger a 3 or 10-year bar, meaning that you can't get a green card. You can't do certain things just because there's this bar in place. It can be very difficult to get a waiver from the bar. The waiver could be an incredibly long time. And frankly, if you've been in the U.S. 30 years, it's unlikely you're going to leave and spend 10 years back in your home country before coming back. We're going to get to a little more humanitarian topics. I mentioned parole because this is a word that's thrown around a lot. Parole has existed for a long time, and it's really when the executive branch decides we're going to admit certain people into this country because of maybe a natural disaster, war, or some circumstance. 2 current examples are Uniting Ukraine, which was really successful because it did 2 things. It allowed people to leave the war zone, but also these people weren't showing up at the southern border. It was a great way for the executive to address a humanitarian issue. The Biden administration currently launched the Reuniting Family Program, and the goal for that was, as it sounds, reunite families. Again, another great use of a program to keep people here, keep communities in place. I have the term dreamer and DACA on here. I don't like to use them interchangeably because you could be a DACA recipient and be a dreamer, or you could be a dreamer and have no options for a U.S. visa at all, since DACA is currently closed. 2 terms that are also in the news a lot are refugees and asylees. Our refugee program was really built out of the fallout of World War II. Horrendous, simply terrible things occurred, and as a nation, we did not take these people in. Post-World War II is a recognition that we need to take people in that are displaced and have no place to go. I often hear this term, oh, refugees are dirty, they're criminals. The farthest thing from it, if you're a refugee, you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution due to race, religion, membership in a social group, or national origin. You apply, you're usually in a third country, you're heavily vetted. It's a very laborious process. Asylees are in the U.S. seeking similar criteria. I've done one asylum case because I've always worked on the business side of immigration. Asylum cases are incredibly challenging because of just the evidence you must present. The case I worked on, we presented medical records about female genital mutilation. Seems like someone should believe you about that, but no, the immigration courts want to see actual proof. I'm going to breeze through a few other terms. Another term is TPS. TPS is just permission to be here temporarily due to a natural disaster, war. It's not a permanent basis to stay in the U.S. Again, there's fees, there's heavy vetting, and if your country has had a natural disaster, it makes no sense for you to hop on a plane and go to a city that's in complete ruin. Deportation, that's when you're sent out of the U.S. Immigration court, I call immigration court a kangaroo court. It is not a true court of law. It is an administrative court, which means rules can change and the government has incredible power.
Hi, can I get one of your pamphlets right now? Hi, can I get one of your pamphlets?
Another term is naturalization. Naturalization is when you become a U.S. citizen, and I added the term denaturalization simply because this is being thrown a lot in Project 25, which is a platform by one of the current political parties, where it doesn't matter if you're here legally. There are some that do believe that certain immigrants were not worthy of U.S. citizenship. And I'm not going to go through all the U.S. agencies, but I added them on there just to show how complex the U.S. immigration system is. There isn't one agency you go to get your immigration issues fixed. Depending on your work visa or if you have a green card path, you may have more than one agency you work with. For my area of work, I work in the healthcare space. And I fell into immigration because most of my roommates during law school were immigrants. And they were doing this amazing biomedical research work, and I was so shocked to see it never talked about. Because I grew up near the Canadian border where Canada's amazing, Canada's great. I also did college in Arizona and a very different view of the southern border. And so it's very eye-opening to me to see all the amazing work immigrants are doing in the U.S. So in my line of work, immigrant doctors. 1 in 4 doctors are an immigrant. 1 in 6 nurses are an immigrant. In fact, our entire healthcare system is really dependent on immigrants for cleaning, disinfecting, translators, allied healthcare roles that without immigrants, you'd have a major crisis in healthcare. So with the heavy lifting out of the way, we're going to turn to our panelists now, and we're going to hear from Julio first. And when I looked at his art, the first thing I thought of was identity. Identity is something we can embrace, we can hide, but it was very apparent there were some strong emotions and strong feelings. So could you tell us who you are and your story?
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you to the folks here and to the folks online. Hello. Thank you for that history, because listen, it's so easy to talk about immigrants without having the context and just, give a stereotype, right? Which is currently the society that we live in, right? And so I feel very lucky to be able to use art as a way to deal with a lot of the xenophobia and be for my own, sake of mind. And because I was just, I grew up here in Long Beach, California, came, to the U.S. in '95, and I knew creativity was my outlet, right? And as I grew up and, realized because my status was going to limit my future, I just dove right into, my artistic, pursuits. The next slide. A lot of my art, I'm very intentional in using color because, again, based on the history and the news that we see about immigrants, about asylum seekers, it's very dark, right? Like the stories and our treatment. But there's a lot of color in our communities. There's a lot of joy. I grew up in the '90s, and so I grew up with Daria and The Simpsons and cartoons that gave so much insight into trying to understand society overall that you can see a clear, inspiration that I took from that. I try to show the very, because if you're an immigrant, you're not allowed to make mistakes, because you just heard all the laws that we have to follow. As a DACA recipient, I have to check in with the government every 2 years and make sure to leave a clean record. Now, I don't know about y'all, but trying to be a perfect person is tiring. But I'm very thankful to be able to use art as a way to cope with a lot of these things. I try to use humor in my art oftentimes because a lot of it just doesn't make sense to me. And if you are around a bunch of immigrants, humor a lot of the times is a way to cope with a lot of this stuff, right? And so I try to implement one of my favorite ones, as an undocumented immigrant who also happens to be queer. I try to, add a lot of that, making fun of the system, making fun of our, I'm also Mexican. You can't really see this image, but it says, pero sigo siendo el gay, which is a song from Vicente Fernandez. Pero sigo siendo el rey, which means I'm still the king. Vicente Fernandez, very macho, like the ultimate, Mexican, man. And I use, that part of my culture to, it informs my own art. And so that's a little bit of kind of the work that I do. But even, next slide, every time I get an opportunity to talk about the work that I do, I also bring in my family, right? Because, 1986 was the last time that people like my parents, would be able to fix their status. But because we came here too late, we came here in 1995, at that time there was nothing, right? And then DACA came around, and only I was able, and my sister, were able to fix our status, which DACA is not really fixing your status. It's sort of like a Band-Aid to make sure we don't get deported. And a lot of us were like, damn, like that's such a, it was a bittersweet moment because we were seen as worthy of, being safe from deportation, but our parents weren't. And so, I always like to bring them in because there's a stereotype about parents, especially immigrant parents, wanting you to become a lawyer or become a doctor, something better than them. But my parents always support me in my creative, pursuits. This picture right here is of my first exhibit. I was repping Hamilton Middle School in North Long Beach at my first art exhibit. I was very lucky that in Long Beach, they're very pro-arts. I went to a very, they were supported, my teacher supported my being an artist. And so my parents were like, well, if that's what you want to do, go for it, right? And I think that's very important, that as someone who's an immigrant and who's an artist, that I share that story, because I'm sure there's people, who might feel like there's this pressure of like, no, but the arts is not going to make me a lot of money or whatever. But it's so, at least to me, it allowed me to find my voice and to be okay with the fact that, look, there's all these laws that I cannot control, but I can control my art, right? And so I also like to, I also bring this photo of my tío Chicho, my uncle, who was also undocumented and was also queer. My uncle came to the US in the early 90s, and I always, unfortunately my uncle passed away, but I look at my family history as a way to like remind myself, like even though DACA is a little shaky right now and I don't know what's gonna happen, I still have it a little better than my family. But it was because of my family, it was people like my tío Chicho that I've even been able to be in the situation where I'm able to get DACA, right? Next slide. This is some photos of me when I was in high school. Again, I went to a place where I was very pro-arts, and growing up, in high school, my teachers always told me like, oh, you should go to college and study art. And I did for like the first or 2 semesters, and then I hated it. I didn't see myself reflected in the art that I was studying as an undocumented immigrant, as a poor, person of color, as a gay person. So next slide. I ended up finding journalism. I remember feeling really sad for myself because I just, couldn't imagine also, I was undocumented, and I was like, what am I gonna do with a degree in art? I just couldn't see it for myself. But then through journalism, I kind of made the circle back into art because I found this flyer. I went to Long Beach City College, and they were looking for a political cartoonist, and I was like, I can do that. How hard can it be? I have ideas. I'm like the result of a political decision that I don't have no control of. I have an opinion. And so I quickly learned that through journalism, and specifically political art, I could speak up about the things that were happening in our communities, right? And I think that this really, it made me think of art as a tool to communicate. And once I graduated from college, the next slide, I ended up graduating from college in 2010. I started in 2001, graduated in 2010. That was a long time, but listen, if you're first gen or undocumented, college, it's not the 4-year path. But I finally graduated in 2010 with a degree in journalism, and here I was kind of feeling sorry for myself, and then I saw this. This was the first time that undocumented immigrants were sort of saying, if you're going to talk about immigrants, if you're going to talk about, I don't think you mentioned the DREAM Act, but before DACA, a lot of us were trying to push for the DREAM Act, which would allow undocumented youth like myself at that time, she's 41 now, to a path to citizenship. And so what they were doing, they were like, we're going to be here, and if you're going to talk about immigration, there's got to be a face to it. And so seeing them, it really pushed me to use my art as a way to continue to talk about immigration. So that's a lot of the work that I do around immigration.
Great, thank you. I like how you brought up the phrase status. I didn't touch on that, but status is how you're recognized by the U.S. government while you're here. Your status can change, it can evolve, or you can fall out of status. Falling out of status would be really undocumented. I'll give you an example that really illustrates why it's a confusing concept. It was Thanksgiving 2018, I was working on a visa renewal for a resident, and I noticed one of their documents had expired. And based on when it had expired, they potentially now had a 3-year bar from being in the U.S. So it's the week of Thanksgiving. Not many people are going to be picking up the phones. A wonderful colleague of mine met with her, calmed her down, and actually approached the agency in the airport because they're the one that changed that document. And he was able to get her document corrected, and so she now has a green card now, but that's how quickly your status can change. Status is also, if you're here on a work visa and you have a family, and family members have dependent visas, you can only stay until you're 21 as a dependent. So DACA actually also covers the children of legal residents in the U.S. because sometimes you could be on a work visa 20 years, but it doesn't lead to a green card. So there's a lot of variations of how people are in the U.S. and our families. You briefly touched on your art. Can you walk through your artistic journey, show some of your favorite pieces?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, like this photo really, it did something to me because, I had this degree in journalism and I was like, I want to work for a newspaper. I want to, be a political journalist. I think people like Lalo Alcaraz and Aaron Magruder who use, political satire and have made a name for themselves, were really impactful in my life. But here was this degree in journalism. I couldn't really, work legally, but I had social media. And so I think social media really helped a lot of these movements, including, the, undocumented student movement, to put our stories out there. And the next slide. And I started using, seeing them really made a huge impact on me. I'm like, here I am complaining about the fact that I couldn't use my degree, but the things that I learned in school, a green card, I didn't need a green card to, to use my degree, right? To document, which essentially was what I ended up doing. A lot of folks around the country started doing a lot of sit-ins, civil disobediences around the country in support of the DREAM Act. And I was like, I need to document this, right? I'm not an organizer, but I can draw and I can tell a story, right? And so I started taking a lot of the images photographs that, the media was covering a lot of the civil disobediences. They were calling us selfish, brats, before it was cool to be called a brat. I was so mad because I was like, these students are changing the narrative around being undocumented. They were coming out of the closet. And so I started taking a lot of these images, and the cap and gown became sort of this representation of fighting back and being in spaces where we were not supposed to be at, because a lot of schools still did not allow undocumented students to go to school. I was lucky here in California that in 2001, AB 540 allowed undocumented students and U.S. citizens to pay in-state tuition if you graduated from a California high school. And so I started doing a lot of these drawings, sharing them online. Some of them I kind of got in trouble for, especially this one, because at that time, this is again 2010, the narrative about being an immigrant, it was like you have to be a good immigrant or, the government is not gonna wanna grant you papers. I'm like, the government is already not doing, is supporting our people. Like, you get to be angry, it's okay. And so I made this image because around this time, I forget what state, they were trying to pass a version of the DREAM Act, which does so the DREAM Act, if you went to a college or if you joined the Army, then it became a pathway to citizenship. There was a version that they were trying to put where it was just the Army version, where, okay, if you want papers, you have to join the Army. And I was like, F that, I'm not gonna, die for a country that doesn't want me.
We got rid of that now.
And yeah, exactly. And so I made this image. A lot of other immigrants were like, hey, Julio, perhaps that art, it's a little bit too, in your face. And I was like, well, we should be allowed to have these feelings about the issues, the policies that are affecting our lives. And so art really allowed me to do that. And then the next one, quickly, I think another thing that I started doing through my art is that picture that you saw, the 5 undocumented students, 4 of them identify as queer. And so I wanted to be very intentional around naming the queerness in this movement, because I mentioned coming out of the shadows was directly taking from the gay liberation movement of coming out. The more that you come out, the less that you're all alone. And so the term undocuqueer started being used around on social media, and I was basically, drawing some of the folks that were, leading this movement and organizing a lot of the sit-ins. And I was like, we need to remember that it was women of color and queers that started telling people, come out of the closet and tell people you're undocumented and unafraid.
And we didn't even touch on, U.S. history. We didn't legalize same-sex marriage until pretty recently, so your situation is almost like a double whammy in that sense, undocumented and identifying as queer.
Oh yeah, a lot of the times I felt like I had to shoot, when I was in queer spaces, I had to, and at that time it was like, let's just only talk about gay marriage, let's just only talk about gays in the military, and I was like, what about trans and queer people who are in detention? And then similarly, when I was in immigrant spaces, and there's a lot of folks who are very religious, who are pro-immigration, but then they're very transphobic and homophobic, and so I had to feel like I had to educate both of my communities I was part of. But I felt that through art, I was able to quickly, throw that in. And I think we can talk about that later, but if we're gonna bring Álvaro.
All right, we'll turn it over to Álvaro now. When we were planning this talk, the Bracero program came up quite a bit, and you wanted to talk about the impact of this program on your family and also identity. It was a very, I think, moving story from looking at some of the art that's produced. I'd love to turn it over to you now to hear your side and your story.
Sure, maybe we can move on to my first slide, please. So I think in order to sort of set the context, I kind of have to take us back to sort of my original hometown. I've been living in Los Angeles for 16 years now, it's home, but I was not raised here. I was born and raised in a working class immigrant community that is the product of migration, specifically Mexican migration. I grew up in East Salinas, California, on California's Central Coast. It's considered the salad bowl of the nation. It produces about 70% of the nation's lettuce. So when we talk about sort of immigrant labor, that is my relationship to the migration story. I didn't learn English until I was maybe first or second grade, growing up in a community where everybody was immigrant or descended from immigrants, and you did not speak English if you didn't have to. And we can move to the next slide. That's because I am a descendant of 2 braceros. Both of my grandfathers, my maternal grandfather and my paternal grandfather were braceros. My maternal grandfather started in 1952, and his first assignment was in Oxnard, which he called Oquisnada. And then he worked in Rancho Cucamonga in a citrus farm. So I have ties to Southern California in a roundabout way. And growing up, I heard a lot of stories from my grandfather, who I was really close to, about his experience as a bracero. My paternal grandfather was working in Texas as a bracero, and he actually did not like the United States, so he moved back in the 70s. He probably did a few spells here in the States, but he stayed in Mexico. My maternal grandfather had 10 kids, and my mom was one of 10, and she moved here in the 70s because of the migration patterns that he had established as a bracero. And he had brought over some of my mom's older siblings, my uncles. And so I come from a generation of 3 generations of migrant farm workers. And so I always own the fact that my subject position is quite privileged, and the fact that I have U.S. citizenship, but I am deeply rooted in sort of the immigrant upraising that I experienced in this country. We can move to the next slide. I have a picture there of my maternal grandfather, whose nickname was Chabelo, and that's my maternal grandmother, Marcelina. And so my grandparents actually, I grew up with them in Mexico, so I had this very transnational existence where I had feet in both countries. I was growing up in an immigrant community in the United States, but visiting Mexico regularly. We would do 3-day drives actually from Salinas all the way to Jalisco in caravans. And we would go groups of maybe 5 or 6 vehicles, and we would spend 3 days driving all the way across the border because there were safety numbers. There was a lot of carjackings at the time. So I always sort of set that context, sort of I am the product of bracero laborers, and that has been a really key aspect of the work that I made in the migration series, which we'll talk about shortly.
Yeah, so we'll definitely look at your art next, but you also work and visit some of the border communities too and have observed some different migration patterns as well. So if you want to go into that, show us your art. And
Sure.
I
So
think it's a very powerful images we're about to see pretty soon.
thank you. Well, aside, from my work as an artist, I currently work in philanthropy, and I recently did a retreat with the Latino Community Foundation, which is a statewide funder, and which works with a lot of border communities specifically. And we did site visits in Tijuana to migrant crisis centers, and I was really taken by sort of the difference in sort of my family's experience with migration, which was, my father was undocumented, but because my mother had legal residency, he was able to get his legal residency in the, I want to say the early 80s. He didn't become a citizen until maybe 2002 because he refused to give up his identity as a Mexican. And it really wasn't until the George Bush administration where he was compelled to vote, and I think that was a really an eye-opening experience for him. But when I did this retreat at the Latino Community Foundation, we went to these migrant crisis centers, and I was really taken by the difference that you mentioned earlier. There was a set of programs, separated families. It was mostly single males who would do like a 8 to 10 month contract in the U.S. They had to go back to Mexico, reapply for another permit, return to Mexico, return to the U.S. My grandfather did that for 20 years. And I used to joke, he was only in Mexico long enough to have a baby with my grandmother, and then he'd come back to the U.S. to continue the migration pattern. But what I saw at the border this time around was not only are you seeing families, but you're seeing a different racial composition. You have a lot of Haitian refugees who are seeking refugee status, but are facing 10 to 11 month wait times, even to establish themselves as refugees, right? So I think that distinction is really important because these are people who are fleeing political and economic upheaval, and they are facing a system where even Democrats are choosing to tighten immigration controls and make it harder, all for the sake of currying the favor of more conservative voters. So I think that's really important to acknowledge in this political moment. In terms of my artwork, as I mentioned, I heard a lot of stories growing up from my grandfather, and my artwork is really an attempt to understand my place in U.S. history. I really grew up with a strong immigrant identity. I identified more as Mexican than I did as quote-unquote American or from the U.S. And so a lot of my art was really an attempt to try to understand my place in this history, because I always felt that U.S. history wasn't really my history, and Mexican history wasn't really my history either, because I was born in the U.S., raised here. So it's sort of trying to find my place within that liminal space. We can move to the next slide. In my artwork, there's a strong conceptual thread to understanding different forms of displacement. I won't go through all the categories here, but one of the things that I find interesting about our place here on Tongva territory is that California sits at the nexus as overlapping regimes of displacement, as I see it. Because you have the displacement of indigenous people, then you had this period of Spanish colonialism, which brought this colonial population, established a Mexican republic, which was then displaced by U.S. Yankee Empire post-1849, and then you've got patterns of, say, gentrification that continue to displace black and brown people. So a lot of my work is trying to situate all these multiple forms of displacement, and I think it's really important when we talk about migration to also acknowledge that even immigrants are settlers on indigenous land, right? So it's such a complicated narrative to try to weave. And so when you get these xenophobic, anti-immigrant rhetoric from Anglo settlers who want to ignore their own positionality as displacing indigenous people, I think it makes the whole immigrant narrative a lot more complicated.
And I talked about the Japanese immigrant earlier, but Miracosta High School, not too far from here, was actually on farmland owned by Japanese that was taken during World War II. The property of land he had actually moved prime real estate because it was 3 blocks in Manhattan Beach. So there's always been this back and forth of taking over land and who has the right.
And I think that, I mean, you bring something very important because as immigrants, you know, the language, the campaigns that we're part of, like, you know, I'm here to stay, you know, like very, a lot of the language kind of repeating this mentality of like, you know, this belongs to me, right? As opposed to like, no, this is like everybody moves, and not to repeat the same sort of language of colonization, right? Like decolonizing ourselves as immigrants is so important because, you know, you also spoke of the folks at the border who are, you know, Haitian immigrants, Black immigrants, right? The anti-Blackness in our immigrant community, you know, and speaking up on those issues like, oh, it's them, but it's not me. Or people who became, you know, they got papers through the last, you know, immigration reform. Like, I did it the legal way. Like, why would you want to repeat, you know, a lot of the things that you suffered through? It's something that I constantly, you know, am like hitting myself against the wall. Like, why don't we learn from the history that a lot of us, you know, we are the result of a lot of this messed up policies and wanting to repeat that. And right, like this idea of like decolonizing the language that we use, wanting to be closer to like whiteness, all those things are so important, and it's so hard to like, you know, have conversations about that, but through art, you know, like you get to, you know, speak to those issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the issue of sort of reproducing U.S. exceptionalism in our immigrant discourse, right? Like, one of the things that I find troubling, having grown up in the Chicanx community, is these constant cries to say, well, this used to be our land, Mexicans belong here. On one level, I agree that it naturalizes sort of understandings of sort of transborder discourse, but it also naturalizes Western expansion and settler colonialism, right? So it's a very tricky territory, and like if you go into the next slide, I can show sort of some samples. Unlike Julio, my parents, who were working class immigrants, who were farm workers and then janitors, they did not support my study of art. Growing up in a working poor immigrant community that had no access to the arts, I was not encouraged to pursue art. And so I studied U.S. history as an undergrad, and I moved to Los Angeles in 2008 to pursue a PhD in ethnic studies, and I ended up following the track of cultural studies and studying the artwork made by undocumented immigrants in a little religious sanctuary in my home state of Jalisco. And it was through my research that I realized I wanted to make art instead of write about it, because it was one of those unfulfilled desires that I had. I was very creative and I drew every day since I was a kid, but I was not allowed to explore that creativity. So when I left the PhD program in 2012, I decided to teach myself printmaking. And I had a conversation with somebody who knew my academic background, and we talked about Jacob Lawrence's migration series that he made in the earlier part of the 20th century, documenting the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South and into the North. And he said, wouldn't it be interesting if you were to try to tell a story about Mexican migration through lino cuts, which is your medium, and that's what we see up on the screen right now. I decided to tell the story of, it was an amalgamated fictional / biographical story of narratives that I heard growing up by my neighbors, my dad, my grandfather, and I try to tell the story of one undocumented immigrant making his journey from Mexico to the U.S., and I called it El Norte Pa' Atrás, which means north and back, to kind of hearken to that binational existence that I had growing up, because I think it's very easy sometimes to think that migration is a one-way path, when in reality, it involves moving back and forth. If you have the privilege of a visa and residency, the narrative isn't always accurate to say that it's a one-way track. You know, my grandparents ended up moving back to Mexico to retire after having lived here for about 20 years. And I wanted to sort of paint that nuanced picture of what migration entails. We can move to the next slide. In this particular image, there's a store called Montemart that was present in East Salinas where I grew up. And that was a very interesting location because you would get the farm laborers would meet there at 5 in the morning, and the agricultural businesses would have these refurbished school buses, which would take the ag laborers out into the fields to their assignment and bring them back. And that was across the street from my middle school. And so I saw that every morning when I was going to school. I would see the farm workers loading up on the buses. And so it's sort of a nod to that experience in my community.
So I lived in Phoenix for my middle school. On the way there, labor was lined up across the Home Depot. The first time I was taking the bus, kind of blew my mind because you didn't see that near the Canadian border. It wasn't something you would see, but it became so common to see in the 90s of that's where you go to work, you just line up and someone will pick you up.
Yeah, we can move to the next slide. In this story, my protagonist here is with the coyote, which is, I use this sort of, I was very inspired by comic books because that's how I learned how to draw. I didn't have access to arts and nonprofits. There was no museums in East Salinas. I drew by looking at comic books. So I wanted the series to kind of crib the visual language, the graphic visual language of comic books to tell this story. And we can move to the last slide. I had to do a shout out to my upbringing in the Salinas Valley. This view right here is something that I saw every day. I grew up about 3 or 4 blocks from the lettuce and strawberry fields. My father was a farm worker up until I was probably in late elementary school, and I have vivid memories of visiting him in the fields. So, I think the main difference here, though, is that I'm telling a story rooted in migration patterns from 30, 40 years ago. I think it's really important to acknowledge folks like Julio who have a very different migration story, right? Mine is one more rooted in the history of the Bracero program to kind of circle back to your initial question. And so I'm very much a product of the Bracero program, but I think it's important to acknowledge that as much as the laws haven't changed in 30 years, the patterns have changed drastically.
We're going to do a few more questions, but then we're actually going to play a game. There's no prize, but it'll be a fun game. Julio, for you, what does representation mean? Be it gender, immigration status, sport, why does it matter in the bigger picture of the arts?
If we can go back to the comic one of mine. It's very important. It's very important because I think for growing up, watching TV, and you mentioned comics. For me, watching TV, and then eventually when I became a journalism major, if it wasn't for the work of, I mentioned Álvaro D, our recruiter, and other sort of journalists and cartoonists of color, I wouldn't have seen myself in the narrative, in the cultural narrative. And so I was, through my work, I've been very lucky to, with social media, kind of get the attention of different folks who have given me platforms to share my story. One of them right now, I do a monthly, well, it started as a monthly, but then it became bi-monthly comic strip that I call Good Immigrant, Bad Immigrant for the LA Times. They have a section, De Los, which is a Latinx specific section. Unfortunately, budget cuts cut their staff, and so now that's why I'm like, it's not monthly, but I'm with that reach, I do this comic strip as a way to change is a strong, I want to add to the narrative of who an immigrant is, right? I feel like I'm continuing to kind of fight those stereotypes of, like we're either good or bad, right? Like you're either a good immigrant who went to school and did what you're supposed to do, or you're a bad immigrant who's, running across the country. What did Trump say? Like eating dogs and, all that narratives, right? But there's no middle. There's no middle narratives about who an immigrant is. And really, this comic strip has allowed me to touch on subjects like dating as an immigrant, because when you're undocumented, and, now it's like, I used to not before, gay marriage became, a thing. I didn't really have to think about like, oh, this person is gonna date me. They're not gonna think about me wanting to date them because of a green card, right? Like now that's something that unless you're an immigrant, like you don't think about those things. And to be able to like talk about those things and, in writing and in a story, I'm adding to the narratives of who an immigrant is, right? I'm also talking about deeper issues like, I've been sober for 4 years, and that's another issue that I've been sort of like grappling, like how do we talk about things that, sobriety and alcoholism and all those things affects everyone. It doesn't care for statuses, but those are things that you're not supposed to talk about because as an immigrant, like you're gonna make us look bad. And so being able to give three-dimensional stories through art, through writing, through comic strip, in my case, it allows me to extend the narrative. And I've been getting messages from other folks who are like, damn, like that piece that you wrote about, dating or, being sober, like it really touched me, right? I feel seen. And I'm only doing the thing that it helped me to come out of the closet, both as an undocumented person and as a queer person. And so I only hope that we continue to have those spaces to share our stories. And another one, can we go back to this one? I started this fellowship. It's a writing fellowship for folks who want to write for Hollywood. And I mentioned Hollywood again, right? Like the things that we grew up watching, the TV shows that we grew up watching, when they had people of color, they had immigrants, and when they had queer people, a lot of the times they were either the joke or, sort of like not taken seriously. And I think as Hollywood is kind of having this sort of like midlife crisis of like, where do we go from here? Like, there needs to be more, not just in the TV, like actors, but writing the stories, right? And so we started, I'm part of the Center for Cultural Power, which it's an artist-led organization. And one of the programs that I started was the Disruptors Fellowship. And as we created this fellowship, we wanted to be very intentional around this fellowship is for folks who are undocumented, folks who are, have a disability, or folks who are trans and non-binary, because a lot of the times we are not the ones writing those stories. And Hollywood is where people who are not in these spaces or who are not in academia, that's who they learn about the other. And so for me, that's a very important thing to have representation, is to actually pay people. And so through this fellowship, we connect folks with mentors who are writing on TV, and we do a showcase and we present their work. So, a lot of the times in order to get these internships, you have to have connections in Hollywood, and a lot of us don't have, even though Hollywood is right here. We watch we consume a lot of this, a lot of the things that the industry puts out, but a lot of times we are not included in the creation of those. So I think, again, it's important for us to create those spaces to be able to create the art.
Thank you. Álvaro, we were talking about the change in this generation from the Bracero program to the modern. I mentioned earlier we've had no immigration changes in really the last 30 years. In your space as an educator, activist, advocate, how is immigration shaping art in California or on a larger scale right now?
I think especially the borderlands, right? Like after my job in philanthropy, I also oversee a fellowship that's aimed at visual artists, and I really make sure that it is representative of the diverse voices in Los Angeles County. One of my fellows is a trans borderlands artist who was born in Mexico, raised in Texas, came to California to pursue his career, and I'm really committed to supporting artwork with those narratives, just like Julio, because Julio and I were talking about this before the panel, and I think one of the things that compels me is, one, we have to recognize the role of artists in movements for social change, and the pivotal role that artists play in shaping cultural narratives, as Julio mentioned, right? Like, I think it's almost like it's an obvious thing to say that cultural attitudes change first, then you have policy changes, which lead to legislative efforts, right? And so it's really important to support those artists who are telling those stories, because the same way that we had a complete culture change, even though there's still challenges to say marriage equality for gay people, right? There's still a lot of work that needs to be done for sort of challenging this hateful rhetoric that's coming from the right, and which is tacitly being supported by a lot of quote-unquote liberals who are afraid to sound like open border radicals, right? There's this hesitation to not sound like that open border radical that's going to open the floodgates, when in reality, you know, as your sort of breakdown of migration laws has shown us, like, migration is actually a historically very natural thing to happen. And it's only until the last, 50, 60 years that we get this rhetoric that demonizes the other. And I think one of the things that I would add to the story that you told is that as soon as the immigrants started being primarily people of color, that stoked a lot of the racial tension, right? And I will acknowledge that people like, say, Italian Americans were demonized once, they have been folded into the narrative of whiteness, right? And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that racial dynamic that exists, that once it's people of color, and in the case of, say, Haitian immigrants who face anti-black racism, then it's dehumanizing rhetoric about people eating cats and dogs. So this is a roundabout way of saying I think a lot of artists are really engaged in this struggle, and they continue to be key players in shaping these narratives.
So you raised a good point about the dangerous rhetoric. We're going to do a quick game. It's true or false questions. There's no penalty if you get it wrong, but it's used to illustrate. Used to illustrate just how much misinformation is out there. So, Julio, is the U.S. immigration system still paper-based applications? True or false?
True.
Yeah, we're still very paper-based. There's right now, I think 20 years they've been developing online forms. We have some now, the system breaks down, doesn't work, they disappear. They didn't take stakeholders like attorneys into consideration, so it's not built for the right system.
And I know this because that's literally how I send my DACA every 2 years. Like, it's a package that I have to deliver, via mail. Otherwise, they cheated on me.
Alvaro, are you entitled to an attorney in the U.S. immigration system?
I believe no.
No, you are not entitled to an attorney. Those that do have an attorney in immigration court usually have a far better outcome in their case. It's a system not designed for a regular person, especially if English is not your first language, or maybe your education level is in elementary school. It's simply not a system designed for average people. Julio, are immigrants more likely to commit a crime than a U.S. citizen? True or false?
False.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So recent studies, I just saw one today where they pulled the uniform crime reporting data and FBI's data, really showed no major correlation of immigration communities to crime. In fact, strong social ties, robust community programming, healthy economies have been known to keep crime down. So in fact, we want immigrants like those in Ohio who are revitalizing communities to help make the U.S. better, because they are reinvesting in our broken down communities that people don't want to live in. Álvaro, true or false? In the coming years, the U.S. economy will depend on immigrants.
True.
Yeah, by 2052, immigrants are going to be the biggest source of growth in our economy. So we really need immigrants in all positions to help keep the U.S. competitive for biotechnology, healthcare, and even building houses. Julio, true or false? Immigrants are not represented in the STEM occupations. So STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics.
False.
Correct. Around 23% of the U.S. workforce in STEM are immigrants. I briefly mentioned the statistics in healthcare, but immigrants are really powering a lot of our major industries in the U.S. And so Biden did have the initiative for semiconductors and these other programs to stimulate U.S. technology. But in order for those programs to be effective, we actually need to update our immigration laws to keep our PhD candidates here who are from foreign countries, expand the H-1B cap, which has been limited to 85,000 for years, to really retain these people. Álvaro, Immigrants have a very large spending power in the U.S., true or false?
That's absolutely true.
That is absolutely true. In a 2002 study, immigrants have $1.6 trillion in spending power, have paid over $500 billion in taxes. Immigrants are contributing to our taxes, Social Security, Medicare. For Social Security contributions, almost 200 billion. For Medicare, 53 billion contributions. So basically, immigrants are propping up the economy. Most other countries experienced a major recession during the pandemic. The U.S. rode it out due to immigration labor, filling in many positions, paying taxes, keeping our economy afloat. Julio, mass deportations have no negative economic consequences, true or false?
False.
Yeah, the economics for a proposed mass deportation would be horrendous. So hypothetically, if we're to deport 1 million people a year, that costs taxpayers $88 billion a year. But we also have to keep in mind the loss in GDP, taxes, so that's almost a $1.7 trillion loss at the highest. We'd also have a loss in taxes, rental properties. It really would decimate the economy. States that would most see an impact would be California, Texas, and Florida, almost a very large immigrant populations. So we did this exercise really to dispel a lot of these myths that immigrants are our friends, neighbors, they're really playing vital roles in our community. With that, do either of you have any closing remarks you'd like to add?
I thank you for that game, but very realistic, way of sort of dispelling a lot of this immigrants. I mean, literally, we had a former president who was married to an immigrant, and it's like really, But anyways, I think that whatever happens, we're in an election, cycle, or it's. And every 4 years, we continue to be used as, like topics, but we are not topics. We are people. And so I just hope that, through the work that we do as artists, we're able to expand beyond the election, cycles. And this is something that I deal with every single day. Not just every 4 years. And so I'm gonna continue to make the artwork because it helps me from my own mental health to not keep all of this inside of me.
I think for me, just not to kick a dead horse, but just sort of, I think in this political moment that we face, right, like we face all these contradictions in immigration discourse. We have somebody like Elon Musk who's anti-immigrant, but is an immigrant himself.
And it was EB5, so someone pointed out a large sum of money to basically buy a green card.
Exactly.
So there you go, see, and so like the intersection of sort of race and class and gender and sexuality is very much shaping the narratives that we see in the media. And I just think it's important for people who come from immigrant backgrounds to acknowledge sort of the complexity of the issue, as I mentioned earlier, right? Like, we are an indigenous land. We don't have a birthright to any space, but I think at the same time, it's really important to naturalize the fact that migration is a historically natural phenomenon, right? And so efforts to stop it, I think, tie into sort of this right-wing hysteria around this replacement theory that is floating around. That there's this real palpable fear by a lot of conservative white populations that their political power is going to be watered down by having all these black and brown people entering the country. And so I think that is sort of underlying a lot of the hate that is circulating, because we're going to be a nation in the next 20 or 30 years that is no longer minority, quote unquote, black and brown people. It is going to be a majority of the population. And I think that drives a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric and the desire to deport people, because there's this zero-sum game that is thought up that if people of color have political and economic power, somehow that's going to displace whiteness from the story.
I just have one announcement and a little bit of questions. If you did find this dialogue enlightening or want to learn more, sign up for the ESMoA newsletter. They do wonderful community programming. but on October 29th from 5:30 to 7 p.m., ESMoA is hosting at El Camino College during the Chicana exhibit a lecture by Gregorio Luke in defense of immigrants, and it's going to be a wonderful panel based on his experience, so I do encourage you to take a look at that. So at this point, we're open to questions from the audience or any questions that came in on our live stream.
Yes, I think there was one question also, what you are currently working on. I think, because honestly, when I saw Julio, when you had the Superman t-shirt on, and I feel like your uncle was really giving this energy, what is your Superman moment?
I mean, I'm working, I mean, aside from the fellowship, I think that's my baby. We've been doing it for 5 years. And every year we're just like, I hope we can continue doing, this kind of work. Personally, I started, thank you for bringing up my uncle back again. So my uncle was like the first gay man I ever met, and again, his experience as an undocumented immigrant was very different from mine. Even though he ended up self-deporting back to Mexico in the mid-2000s, unfortunately passed away in 2018. And I never came out to him. And I always, in the back of my head, was like, one day I'll be able to go back to Mexico and have a conversation with him. Unfortunately, because of the laws, I never was able to go back before he passed away. But after he passed away, my aunt sent me this package with a bunch of photographs of him living here in the U.S. And I've been, very sort of like, I'm like, oh my God, I'm part of this like queer history in my life. And I've been sort of documenting that through my Instagram. And as part of that, I worked on a book proposal to do a graphic memoir about how my uncle was just super key in me. Like there's this sort of like, especially when you come from a religious Catholic Mexican household, like being queer, you just don't talk about. My uncle was like, I don't care, I'm gonna be me. It was messy, it was old things, but I had a floor plan by the time that I came out. I never had to do like a whole like, Dios, I'm gay. In my research, and I'm hoping, so through DACA, you're able to ask for permission to leave the country. And I just did it's called advanced parole. And I'm waiting for it, hopefully. I'll get the permit and I'm gonna do my research. I've been interviewing family members, and when I interviewed his best friend, and I asked him, I'm like, Agustin is his name, I'm like, I never came out to my uncle, and I was like, do you think he knew? He was like, girl, he knew since you were a little kid, and so that's sort of like unpackaging this sort of history through a comic memoir, and very some of my comparing to Fun Home and Persepolis are some of my favorite graphic memoirs, and so hopefully, I don't know, that's something that I'm like very deeply connected to my uncle.
Thank you.
Hopefully.
A lot of my work has been focusing on my work as an educator and philanthropy, but I am making time for my creative practice. I'm still really interested in immigrant culture, but I also think it's really important. I'm non-binary, I identify as queer, but I grew up around a lot of patriarchy and homophobia and misogyny. And so I'm trying to mine different archives to sort of, in a way, unpack my own socialization as a male, even though I don't identify as a male anymore. I grew up in the thick of Mexican patriarchy, and so I think it's really important not to romanticize immigrant experiences as purely motivational and beautiful and revolutionary, because immigrants and their descendants are also complex people who make mistakes and who reproduce cis heteropatriarchy. So one of the things that I grew up, I'm going back to my love of comic books. I grew up surrounded by these comic books called El Libro Vaquero that my dad would read. It was his only form of literacy. And these are stories set in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, told from a Western white settler perspective, but which were created from Mexican diasporic communities in the U.S. and in Mexico, and they tell stories of sort of indigenous dispossession, the blonde woman who's a damsel in distress, being protected by the macho cowboy. So I'm actually learning how to do digital illustration, to create a series of illustrations that kind of unpack this patriarchal narrative in these comic books. And I hope to also do some collage pieces around these graphic novels. Because as I mentioned, a lot of my research as a graduate student revolved around sort of the way that images tell stories. And so really it's an attempt to try to critique diasporic Mexican immigrant culture from the perspective of a descendant of immigrants.
And I just want to say, like, that's so important to, like, again, right, like, you sort of mentioned, like, the idea of, like, dispelling this sort of, like, good immigrant, you know, idea, because white people get to be complex all the time, you know? How many movies do we see of, like, you know, the killer that's white but is beautiful and, like, they're complex? Like, we should also be able to tell those stories without being worried about, you know, the sort of, like, is that gonna have an effect on the policy? Or, like, what I'm saying, is it gonna, like, add to the stereotypes? Like, you know, we should also be allowed to be complex, and those are the realities of our communities, right? Our communities are messy, and, you know, being able to tell a story, you know, sort of like unpacking the messiness, I love that. It's just, you know, yeah, I love it. So what's at that?
Yeah, just as a quick side note, I mean, I think like it goes to your point earlier, Julio, about the good immigrant, the bad immigrant. I think that we worry so much as people of color about how we're perceived by others, right? That we forget to embrace that we also make mistakes, that we're also messy. And I think, you know, we should all be afforded complex personhood and the ability to be complicated human beings. I don't believe in these black and white narratives that somebody's either good or bad. I think that there's nuance in the human experience, and we should all be allowed to not have to be perfect all the time.
I have a question from my stream from Easy 2002 that asked, how does your immigrant art show challenges, advancing different cultures, and being in a new place?
Can you repeat it again?
Yeah, so he asked, how does your art show the challenges, advancing different cultures, and being in a new place?
You know, it's interesting. I think that's something that I'm about to embark if I do get this advanced parole permit, because I haven't been back to Mexico since I was 11 years old. I'm 41 years old now, and I'm about to have a cultural, like, explosion in my face, and it sounded weird. And so I'm kind of getting ready. I was having a conversation with a young person that was here. They had to leave early. They're from Puebla, and you know, I was like, if I go to Mexico, how are they going to receive me? How are they going to receive my queerness, right? Like, that is what I'm worried about. I am more Americanized, whatever that means. That when I go, that's going to be my new change. And how am I going to be able to put that into my art, right? Like, again, the romanticization of, like, going back to the homeland. I'm scared, because I'm scared of, like, feeling like, oh, I don't know how to operate here, right? Thankfully, I have friends that have DACA and that have been able to go back, and they do tell me, they're like, girl, it's different. Like, we're no longer culturally, from that area, and that's a weird feeling. And I'm leaning. I'm nervous, but I want to lean into, like, whatever it is. I have this idea that I'm gonna go. Like, I had an idea to go back and have a conversation with my uncle, but I don't know what that's gonna look like. I don't know. And I remember one time I did a workshop with Bienestar, which is a gay Latino organization. And I did this workshop about art, with older immigrant men, a lot of them from Mexico and Central America. And in one of my pieces, I have the word joto, which is, like, kind of saying F, like a slur. And I used it in, like, reclaiming it. And they like came for me. They were like, how dare you use that word? Like a lot of us had to immigrate, from Mexico. And I was like, no, but I'm like reclaiming it and it's like different. And they were like, no, like you little kid, you don't understand. And so like that I will never forget that. And so I'm like, what if I say the wrong thing if I'm, when I go back? I don't know what that's gonna like, but that's kind of how I'm like looking. I'm excited and scared at the same time as an artist, how I'm gonna do that.
I think the way that I experience outsiderness, I grew up feeling like a perpetual outsider in this country and in Mexico, because when I would go to Mexico, it was perfectly obvious to me that I was not raised in that cultural milieu. Like the cultural references were very different from my U.S. upbringing, but I also experienced that outsiderness, even though I proclaim my love for East Salinas, where I grew up. I have been in Los Angeles for 16 years. Salinas has changed radically in this time period. Salinas was a city that was shaped by Bracero migration, primarily from immigrants from Jalisco, Michoacán, Zacatecas. Now you go to Salinas and it's primarily indigenous people from southern Mexico who are the farm workers, right? So I think that there's also like this generational privilege that people from the Mexican diaspora experience. After having been here for so many generations, you become, for lack of a better word, acculturated or assimilated, and you access privilege, right? And so I go back to Salinas, and even though my parents lived there, I feel like an outsider because most of my neighbors now are indigenous Mexicans from southern Mexico. And even though I am of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, I did not grow up with an indigenous identity. I do not speak Mixteco. I don't speak these languages that people speak in southern Mexico in predominantly indigenous communities. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that even immigrant communities here in the U.S. are changing, and we live in Los Angeles, which has the biggest indigenous population in the country, right? And that includes people from the global south. It's not just U.S. native indigenous people. And so I think it's really, in the context of these immigration narratives, it's really important to acknowledge that there's, it's not to play the oppression Olympics, as they say. There's different forms of marginalization, but I think that folks who are descended from immigrants from several generations ago, who access generational privilege, need to acknowledge like our outsiderness in this different immigrant reality.
I think at this point, we should give a big applause for our amazing panel.